And now our main star comes on, Tom Chi. Tom and I have known each other for probably 7 or 8 years in this lifetime, maybe a couple lifetimes before as well. And Tom is one of not only my dear friends, we've co-invested in companies and supported companies. We've mentored so many companies together. We've had lots of fun together. And Tom has a mind that is as brilliant and as expansive as his heart and his soul is. And he's an extraordinary man, as you will hear and see and feel. And eager for Tom to share his thoughts about water and inspire us with any questions you have. You're welcome to put them in the chat. We won't answer them during the conversation, but we or Tom will look at answering them afterwards. So please don't hesitate to share any questions that you have. Thank you, Tom.
All right, great. So I'm going to do a presentation. It'll be about 20 minutes, and then there'll be a little bit of time for questions at the end, and then there'll be a lot of time to connect after that. So we're just going to jump right in. All right. So water and the ecology of interbeing. So first I'm going to start with a story about water. And this, I would say, is maybe the most common story about water that kind of undergirds a lot of the high level discussions and economic discussions and geopolitical discussions about water. And it basically comes out to something like, there's a limited amount of water on the planet, 1.3 billion cubic kilometers, 321 million cubic miles of water are on the planet. And this visualization on the left-hand side, you can go see what what all the water on the planet looks like when put into a ball as opposed to spread out across the oceans. Of the 1.3 billion cubic kilometers, 97.5% of it salt water, only 2.5% of it fresh water, which is the stuff that we are typically using, and only 0.3% of it, 0.03% of it is in near the surface, in rivers and lakes and permafrost, things that are pretty readily, easily usable. And I think because we kind of come at water with this sort of story, there's a narrative that emerges where it's like, look, there's so little fresh water on the planet. It's a limited commodity. And with growing population and climate destabilization and worsening weather events and all these pressures, we're just it just cannot help but lead to mass shortages and potentially even wars that we fight over water. And I would encourage you all to examine, when you hear narratives about water, ask yourself, is that the underlying assumptions that people have here? Because I think in most of the stories that I've seen about our future relationship to water, that's kind of the underlying story. But I think if you start from that story, you're basically setting yourself up for a lot of potential conflict, and conflict that is unnecessary, because even though this is a truthful way to go and look at this, it is not the only perspective that you can have that is truthful about water. And an alternative perspective could enable us to find new ways to be in harmony with water and each other. So I kind of summarize the story above as the story of water as a noun, like the story of water as a limited commodity on the planet, as a noun that we trade in acre feet, a noun that we go and manage like any other commodity, like gold or steel or aluminum or what have you. And we're going to explore in this talk the concept of water as a verb. All right. So in order to get there, we need to get a little bit deeper than, like most of this is salt water, 97.5% of it is salt water, 2.5% of it fresh water, which is what we have in this left-hand bar here. If you zoom in, you can really start to get a sense of where the fresh water is. You zoom in a little bit further, you can get a sense of where it all kind of sits. And in here includes living things. Like this includes the water that flows inside of living things and allows all of life to exist. And over here, for the folks that are technically or scientifically inclined, are the exact numbers of exactly where all these numbers where all this water is. And this is kind of, we're starting with the big noun and now we're breaking it into smaller nouns right now, but we still haven't broken out of the noun frame yet. And we have a lot of numbers, but the numbers are kind of so large in some way that, that it's kind of hard to get a sense of how they relate to each other. So let's go another step further into this and try to visualize this. So the oceans are down here. And actually, for the sake of this, since you guys are actually seeing my whole screen, I can just show this. If I zoom out, I drew everything to scale, including the oceans. So if I zoom all the way out, then there's the oceans. See that block? Yeah, that's the oceans. Now we're going to zoom back into the presentation. And these squares above are relative to that big block down below. And this is all the numbers that you just saw in the previous slide, but with actual represented as a physical space on the screen. So you can see how much do all of these entities kind of hold different types of water. But so at this point, we're still treating water as a noun, but we're getting a little bit more nuanced about, what are all the subcomponents of that noun. And now we're going to start moving into the verb. Because I didn't arrange it, in this way accidentally. Really, there's two kind of major cycles that are happening here. There's evaporation that comes from the ocean, which leads to, and that brings a lot of water into the atmosphere. Then through precipitation, it lands on the Earth's surface and nurtures life, puts moisture in the soil, feeds the rivers, fills the wetlands, fills the lakes. And some of it, seeps into the ground and becomes groundwater. And through the process of gravity all the way down, it'll eventually, through rivers and groundwater, it will eventually get back to oceans. And then there's a second cycle that's happening here, which is a freezing and melting cycle. And that's mostly happening in relationship to large bodies of ice, so Antarctica, glaciers up in and ice caps. The northern ice cap as well. So now we're starting to get into the verbs a little bit. At the end of the day, these are not abstract, commodities that have no relationship to each other. Through these arrows, the water flows, and one thing feeds the next, and really cutting off the arrow at any of these points has major downstream effects. And I think as soon as you start to do this, you start to see some of the value of moving to a verb frame. But we're going to go even further into the verb frame here. And imagine there's the container. So the atmosphere as a container holds almost 13,000 cubic kilometers of water. But in terms of how much water flows through it, and you can imagine the 13,000 cubic kilometers is the size of this square. But the amount of water that flows through the atmosphere in a year is a square that's this large. So much larger, about 39 times larger than the amount that sits in the atmosphere at any given moment. And it cycles through because of that, that many times in a year, which means effectively you get the effect of a full cycle every 9.3 days. And that also means that given the size of this box here, there is enough water that falls out of the atmosphere every 9.3 days. The volume of that is the equivalent to the volume of 6 times all the rivers in the world. So think about all the big mighty rivers and how much water they move, and multiply the total output of all those rivers by a factor of 6. That's what the atmosphere drops on us every 9.3 days. Now, and you can see now actually the power of the verb that the atmosphere is doing is actually a lot more compelling than the fact that the atmosphere happens to be a holding spot, for a certain amount of water at any given moment. And the movement of this water through the atmosphere is the thing that creates the valuable function, whether it's dropping the rain that goes and brings things to life, or has the rivers grow, the rivers flow, or your fields grow. This is kind of the engine of it. And this is what we start to get closer to when we focus more on the verb as opposed to the noun. Similarly, we can take the amount of water that is in rivers, which is about 2,000 cubic kilometers, and we talk about how much of it flows through the rivers in a year. And this is, once again, the smaller is how much is held in rivers at any given moment, and the larger box represents the volume of water that proportionally sized to be the volume of water that flows through rivers in a year. And rivers, flow globally. If you aggregate everything together, rivers flow enough to do 17.6 entire cycles in a year. So basically an equivalent amount to the full volume of all the rivers in the world cycles through those rivers in 20.7 days. And of course you have a longer river, a bigger river, it'll take longer than that, and there'll be shorter rivers that take less than that. But when you average it all out, then we're basically discharging the full volume of all the rivers in the world every 20.7 days. And this gives a little bit of grounding to the phrase, you can never step in the same river twice. This is actually factually true. And it's completely different stuff every 20 days, just like the atmosphere is completely different stuff every 9 days. And just like the atmosphere and rivers are a container, a conduit, that allows a particular type of verb to move through it, like this much larger square, this much larger square. Life itself can also be understood to be a conduit of this type. And as we are starting to expose these verbs, we're seeing the interconnections, and the interconnections give us a way more nuanced way of understanding what is happening between all these different conduits. Now, this is going to get a little bit nerdy again for a second, but I think it's a good way to go hammer home the point. But this is some research that came from Abigail Swan's Ecoclimate Lab up at the University of Washington, published a couple years ago. And basically, in 2018, we had just had a couple years of major drought and wildfire in California. And one of the tasks that her lab decided to model is, well, let's say that keeps on continuing, which is actually what our current expectation is, that California will continue to dry out and that we'll have more wildfires in the coming decades. But she was like, let's say that continues to happen. So let's go set in our model some regional forest loss. Now that regional forest loss means that the gross plant productivity, like the amount of biomass that is in plants, is going down in that area, which actually means that there's less transpiration from that area. The transpiration from the area absolutely changes the flow of the atmospheric hydrology, so all the water that's moving in the atmosphere. And what her lab specializes in is understanding the large-scale impacts of a regional change. So if California continues to lose trees, it changes net transpiration. It starts to modify atmospheric circulation. It will then create a delta in climate. And this is just one of the deltas. This is the temperature change. But the net ecological response is that gross plant productivity all around the Midwest, basically ranging from Canada down to Texas, drops in a significant way. And this is an example of how the verbs actually dominate here. There's a certain amount of water that was flowing through life in the forms of trees. There's a certain amount of water that was flowing through the atmosphere, through atmospheric, hydrological cycles. And the interconnection between those two can completely dry out a large portion of a continent. Like basically some wildfires in California could completely dry out the American heartland in terms of production. Though if you flip it around, it actually means active reforestation in the West Coast can improve the gross plant productivity in the Midwest and lead to way better farming, as well as ecological restoration. And when we get into the verbs of this stuff, it gets so much more potent than saying, oh, I have a river and I'm selling this many acre feet to these farmers, where you're treating it as a noun, like a commodity. Like seeing these verbs allow us to find interconnections that help us make better decisions about, whether from the policy, conservation, or from the, business and economic side. So we're going to have a tiny interlude to go talk about the concept of interbeing. And it's a pretty ancient Buddhist concept, but I like the phrasing of it, in modern times as the phrase interbeing. And this quote from Thich Nhat Hanh, I think captures it pretty well, which is, and this was kind of his reflection on looking at a flower. And in looking at a flower, he says, well, there's nothing that is not present in the flower, because, when we see the flower, we are also, like, we see the petals of a flower, we see the stem of a flower, we see the leaves of a flower. But actually what we are seeing in seeing the flower is we are seeing sunshine, we are seeing rain, we are seeing the clouds that led to the rain, we are seeing all these factors that, if any of those were to disappear, then the flower would also disappear. Like, there is the being that is the flower it is so reliant on all these other metabolisms that surround it that it isn't really an independent being. The flower, like all of us, everything living on this planet, is in a state of interbeing with these forces surrounding it, with these verbs, with these metabolisms surrounding it. And the flower, as per the quote, the flower has to be with the sunshine, the cloud, with the rain, with everything in the cosmos in order to exist. Now, why is this important? Well, as we get into these verbs, now we are starting to understand the exchange of interbeing that allows life to exist, allows the rivers, streams, lakes, all the bodies of waters to function appropriately. And let's now take that lens back to people and the environment. So what does it look like for human beings to interbee with water? Well, average person weighs 62 kilograms, 60% water by mass. That means 37.2 kilograms of water weight. Depending on whether you're a man or woman, then you drink, either 2.5 to 3.5 kilograms of water per day. So we'll just say it's average of 3, a little bit over 1,000 a year. And that means we cycle out our full water weight. The full weight of all the water in our body cycles out 29 times per year. In other words, once every 12.4 days. And that means, one way that I've thought of this, which really stuck with me when I recognized how much water is constantly flowing out of me. It means that after 12.4 days, it could be that none of the water that is in you is the same as the water that was in you 2 weeks before. Like, you're definitely exchanging out an amount that is equivalent to all the water in your body in that much time. And what that means is that if you were to go to a physical place in the world, after 12.4 days of being in that place, nearly all the water in your body is from that place. So the majority of your mass is from that place within 12.4 days. And I don't know a sensibility of interbeing that would be more intimate than the majority of you has changed out, has exchanged with that environment in 2 weeks. And what it means is that the water that we live around becomes us. 12.4 days later, the water that is around us is in us. And it leads to a more compelling look at some of these questions. Like, if the water we live around becomes us in a very literal sense, then what happens when we live next to polluted rivers? What happens when we allow industrial emissions to create acid rain? What happens when we are dumping heavy metals, fertilizers, effluents, human waste, animal waste into rivers, streams, and bays? Like, that stuff plus 12.4 days becomes us. And when you start to understand the flowing of rivers around you as a literal factual extension of the thing that will become you, then you start to understand pollution differently. You start to understand acid rain differently. Is that what I want to become in a certain amount of time? Do I want my body constituted out of the things that we are doing to the hydrological cycles? And the only conclusion that I can draw from pulling these things together is that there's no fundamental split. There's no fundamental split between internal and external ecology. We have drawn it like that for the convenience of explanations in textbooks and to have a separate discipline of medicine than biology, than hydrology, than civil engineering. And for the purpose of study, that's fine, that's fantastic. But at the, because look, somebody's not going to become a PhD in 12 fields in order to go understand this stuff. But I think we should also recognize that at the more basic level, outside of the conveniences of being able to split up disciplines so that you can issue PhDs or advanced degrees, that the truth is that there is no fundamental split between internal and external ecology. And to the extent that we're coming from that understanding, we're going to make better decisions. And I'll leave you with one last thought about this on a way to be looking at water. So a new framework that the, instead of treating water like a noun, a commodity, and then trading it around just like everything else that we trade in a market, what if we were to start thinking about to treat the movement of water as something that was sacred? And that we started taking a lens of, instead of trading a commodity for maximum economic benefit, and I'm not saying that there won't be plenty of great business opportunities and ways to have this work with economy, but what if we were to take, understand that the flow of water is what powers all of life on Earth, and start asking ourselves the question how we maximize the benefits to all the organisms that are on the chain of that water. And in this picture, I show some arrows like, rain is going to follow on, on this hilltop and start to roll down with gravity. There's mist that's going through the valley right here. This sunny spot is probably experiencing some evaporation, transpiration. So this is just some water moving through the environment. And let's treat this flow as sacred. And what might it make us consider? Well, I'm roughly following the elevation line of this background hill for purposes of illustration. But imagine here is a water molecule. It falls as rain at this high elevation. And over time, it's slowly, going downstream toward a river, toward the ocean. But in the process of doing that over that same time period where it falls as rain and it's flowing downstream, it's slowly benefiting more and more organisms. Maybe for a moment it is part of a fish, and then it's part of a plant, and then it's part of, some amphibians, and then it's part of a mosquito, and then it's part of what have you. All these organisms are basically being benefited by the flowing of that water. And in a way, you can imagine two different ideas, they're partner ideas, even though one of them is not about water. But one thing that I have sometimes shared, relative to the way that life is trying to make sense of the planet, at the most basic levels, even before humans were around. I sometimes say that the algorithm for life is just to savor every photon. So we have a planet where these photons come and hit the planet, and the energy from the sun, the energy from the photons is what animates, almost everything that we see around us, other than the occasional volcanic eruptions, that's where, in nuclear decay. Other than those comparatively smaller effects on the planet, like sunshine is where all this energy is coming from. And life is basically just an algorithm that is trying to go savor every photon. But what is true of those photons is also true of the water molecules. Like, imagine we could, for every photon that comes in, life tries to savor it, but also imagine that for every water molecule that is evaporated by the sun and floats and falls as rain, every water molecule, if we could imagine the savoring of every water molecule to benefit the most organisms as it goes and follows its path, of high potential energy from high elevation down to low potential energy in the ocean. Imagine in that process, we could be thinking about how to manage flows in a way that would maximize the benefit to all organisms on the way there. With that, I shared a couple different ways of thinking about water, and I'd love to take any questions. And this is how you contact me if you want to contact me or follow me on social media or watch a talk about the work that I do. Those are the things. So take a screenshot if that's interesting, and I'm going to pop back out and see some questions.